July 7th, 1941. Dawn. 4,000 American Marines stepped off transport ships onto Icelandic soil, their boots crunching on volcanic rock as they looked across a landscape that seemed pulled from another world. Behind them, the Atlantic stretched 3,000 miles back to home. Ahead lay a treeless expanse of lava fields and windswept plains that would become the most strategic piece of real estate in the war that America wasn't officially fighting yet. The Marines adjusted their packs, felt the bite of Arctic wind even in summer, and wondered what they were doing here. Most had never heard of Iceland before receiving their orders. Now they were standing on it, armed and ready, while their country remained at peace. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just made a decision that would change everything. He'd ordered American troops to occupy Iceland, a neutral country, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, 4 months before Germany would declare war on the United States. No shots were fired, no declaration of war was issued. But in that moment, Roosevelt crossed a line that American presidents had refused to cross for 2 years. He put American soldiers directly into the combat zone of a European war. The question everyone asked then, and historians ask now, was simple. Why Iceland? The answer lay in a map Roosevelt studied almost every morning in the White House. A map of the Atlantic Ocean covered in red marks showing where German submarines had sunk Allied ships. By July 1941, those marks formed a pattern that terrified anyone who understood what they meant. Each red mark represented a ship. Each ship represented dozens of sailors. Each sinking represented tons of food, fuel, weapons, and hope sliding beneath the waves. Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Every week, German U-boats sent another dozen cargo ships to the bottom of the ocean. Ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, everything Britain needed to survive. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Britain consumed supplies faster than convoys could deliver them. The island nation imported half its food, all its oil, most of its raw materials. Cut those supply lines and Britain would collapse without Germany ever needing to invade. Roosevelt knew this, Churchill knew this, and Adolf Hitler knew this. The Führer had told his admirals that U-boats would win the war before German armies ever set foot on British soil. He was right. Britain could survive German bombs. It could rebuild factories and cities. It had proven that during the Blitz, when London burned night after night and still kept fighting. But it couldn't survive without food and fuel. If you're finding this history as gripping as we are, hit that subscribe button for Orders of History. We dive deep into the decisions that shaped World War II, one order at a time. The problem wasn't just the U-boats themselves. The problem was geography. German submarines operated from bases in Norway and France, launching into the Atlantic to hunt convoys crossing from North America to Britain. The distance from Brest, France to the mid-Atlantic was roughly 1,000 miles. From there, U-boats could intercept convoys traveling the northern route from Halifax to Liverpool or the southern route from New York to Glasgow. British and Canadian escort ships tried to protect the convoys, but there was a gap. A massive, deadly gap in the middle of the Atlantic where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. Aircraft of that era had limited range. British planes flying from bases in Northern Ireland or Scotland could cover perhaps 300 miles out to sea. Canadian planes flying from Newfoundland could manage similar distances. But in between lay nearly 1,000 miles of open ocean where air cover simply didn't exist. Submarines could surface in this gap, recharge batteries, attack at will, then dive and escape before surface escorts could respond. Ships would disappear, their escorts frantically searching while the U-boat submerged and slipped away. Sometimes dozens of ships would be picked off from a single convoy over the course of several days. The convoys called it the Black Pit. The area where you were alone, vulnerable, and death came from beneath the waves. But there was one place that could close that gap. One island sitting almost exactly halfway between North America and Britain. One piece of volcanic rock that could host air bases, naval facilities, and radar stations capable of covering hundreds of miles of ocean. Iceland. The island sat like a stepping stone across the North Atlantic. Reykjavik to Scotland was 650 miles. Reykjavik to Greenland was 800 miles. Aircraft based in Iceland could patrol vast stretches of the Atlantic that were previously beyond reach. The Black Pit could be illuminated. Britain had recognized this back in May 1940. When Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, Britain immediately occupied Iceland, despite Iceland's declaration of neutrality. The strategic logic was irrefutable. Better to apologize to Iceland than let Germany seize bases there. The Icelandic government protested. The Icelandic people, who had declared independence from Denmark only 2 years earlier, resented foreign troops on their soil. But Britain was polite, apologetic, and absolutely immovable. Iceland's location made it too important. The occupation would continue. British forces had been holding Iceland ever since, but by 1941, Britain had a problem. Every soldier stationed in Iceland was a soldier not fighting in North Africa, not defending Singapore, not preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Britain needed those troops. The British Army was stretched across 3 continents, fighting in the Western Desert against Rommel's Africa Corps, defending Burma and Malaya against potential Japanese aggression, and manning the home islands against possible German invasion. Churchill had been asking Roosevelt for months, could America take over Iceland? Could American forces relieve the British garrison troops? Roosevelt wanted to say yes. He understood the strategic logic as well as Churchill did. He'd been studying those maps with their red marks. He'd watched the casualty figures climb. In March 1941 alone, German U-boats sank over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping. In April, another 500,000 tons. In May, 400,000 tons. At that rate, Britain would be bled white by the end of the year. But Roosevelt faced a political problem that Churchill didn't have. America wasn't at war. The American public had watched Europe tear itself apart twice in 25 years. World War I, the war to end all wars, had killed 100,000 American soldiers and accomplished what? Europe was at war again. Millions of Americans believed that European wars were European problems. Let Britain and Germany fight it out. America would stay home, stay safe, stay neutral. The America First Committee, one of the largest anti-war organizations in American history, had 800,000 members by 1941. Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous aviator, spoke at their rallies, warning that Roosevelt was trying to drag America into another European bloodbath. Senators and congressmen echoed these concerns. The polls showed Americans sympathized with Britain but didn't want to fight Germany. Roosevelt disagreed. He believed that Nazi Germany posed an existential threat to democracy everywhere. That if Britain fell, America would face a hostile fascist coalition controlling Europe and possibly allied with Japan in the Pacific. He'd watched Germany conquer Poland in 4 weeks. He'd watched Denmark fall in hours, Norway in weeks, France in 6 weeks. He'd watched the British Army evacuate from Dunkirk, leaving behind all its heavy equipment, barely escaping annihilation. He understood that Britain was running out of time, and if Britain fell, America would stand alone. But Roosevelt was a politician. He couldn't simply declare war because he believed it was necessary. He needed Congress. He needed public support. He had neither. So he found another way. In the months before July 1941, Roosevelt had taken incremental steps, each one pushing America closer to war without technically entering it. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, allowed America to send weapons to Britain without requiring immediate payment. Britain would pay later somehow when the war was over. It was a transparent fiction, but it allowed American factories to supply British forces while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. The extension of the Pan-American Security Zone allowed American ships to patrol further into the Atlantic. The agreement to repair British warships in American ports. The transfer of 50 old destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for base rights in British territories. Each step drew criticism. Each step was called warmongering by Roosevelt's opponents. Isolationist senators accused him of violating neutrality, of seeking war, of betraying the American people who had voted for peace. But each step was legal, defensible, and carefully calibrated to avoid the tripwire of actual combat. Iceland was different. Iceland was American troops on foreign soil in a war zone. This wasn't sending weapons or patrolling distant waters. This was occupation. Roosevelt's advisors argued about it for weeks. Secretary of War Henry Stimson supported the move. He believed America would be at war soon regardless, and Iceland was too important to leave vulnerable. Secretary of State Cordell Hull worried about the legal justifications. Iceland was neutral. How could America occupy a neutral country without a declaration of war? Roosevelt listened to both sides. He consulted with military planners who showed him projections of convoy losses with and without Iceland. He read intelligence reports about German interest in the island. He studied those maps with their red marks, watching the pattern spread like a disease across the Atlantic. Then he made his decision. On July 1st, 1941, he sent a message to Congress. It wasn't a request for a declaration of war. It wasn't even technically a request for authorization. It was a notification. American forces would be occupying Iceland, effective immediately to prevent German seizure of strategic territory in the Western Hemisphere. The framing was careful. Roosevelt didn't say America was entering the European war. He said America was defending the Western Hemisphere. Iceland, he argued, was close enough to Greenland, which was close enough to Canada, which was close enough to America. Therefore, defending Iceland was defending America. The logic was stretched thin enough to see through. Everyone knew it. Iceland was 2,600 miles from New York. By Roosevelt's logic, half of Europe could be considered part of the Western Hemisphere's defense perimeter, but it gave Congress just enough cover to avoid a confrontation. The isolationists protested. Senator Burton Wheeler called it an act of war. Senator Robert Taft warned that Roosevelt was becoming a dictator. But they didn't have the votes to stop him, and they knew it. The momentum had shifted. Not enough for war, not yet, but enough for this. On July 7th, the first American troops landed. 4,000 Marines initially, followed by over 20,000 additional soldiers in the weeks that followed. They relieved British forces who shipped home to fight in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The Americans built barracks, expanded airfields, installed radar stations, and established naval facilities. The work was hard, the conditions harsh. Iceland in summer was cold and wet. Iceland in winter would be brutal. The landscape offered no timber for construction, no shelter from the wind, no comfort. Everything had to be shipped in. Lumber, fuel, food, equipment, all of it carried across 3,000 miles of U-boat-infested ocean. The Marines adapted. They built Quonset huts against the wind. They expanded the airfield at Reykjavik until it could handle heavy bombers. They constructed fuel storage tanks, ammunition depots, barracks for thousands of men. They installed radar stations on hills overlooking the ocean, giving early warning of any approaching aircraft or ships. Within weeks, Iceland transformed from a British outpost into an American bastion. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. American aircraft based in Iceland could patrol convoy routes across the northern Atlantic. PBY Catalina flying boats, with their 1,000-mile range, could now cover areas previously beyond reach. They spotted U-boats on the surface, forcing them to dive, disrupting their attacks. They radioed convoy positions, helping surface escorts avoid submarine concentrations. American warships operating from Reykjavik could escort convoys further east than ever before. Destroyers that previously had to turn back halfway across the Atlantic could now refuel in Iceland and continue all the way to Britain. The gap where U-boats hunted freely began to shrink. But the real change wasn't tactical. It was psychological and political. Germany watched American troops occupy Iceland and understood exactly what it meant. America wasn't neutral anymore. America was protecting British convoys. America was operating in the European war zone. America had chosen sides. Hitler's response revealed how seriously he took this. He ordered his U-boat commanders to avoid attacking American ships at almost any cost. He didn't want incidents that might push America into the war before Germany was ready. The order created an absurd situation. German submarines would track convoys, identify targets, then break off attacks when they realized American destroyers were providing escort. American and German warships shadowed each other across the Atlantic, neither side firing, both sides waiting for someone else to start the shooting. U-boat commanders sent increasingly frustrated reports back to headquarters. They had targets, they had opportunities, but they had orders. Don't attack American ships. The restriction was strangling their offensive. Convoys that would have been easy prey escaped because they sailed under American escort. It couldn't last. Everyone knew it couldn't last. In September 1941, a German U-boat fired torpedoes at the American destroyer USS Greer. The circumstances were murky. The Greer had been tracking the submarine, broadcasting its position to British aircraft. The U-boat captain, feeling threatened, launched a defensive strike. The torpedoes missed. The Greer counterattacked with depth charges. No one was killed. But the incident gave Roosevelt the justification he needed. He went on national radio and announced a new policy. American ships would shoot on sight any German or Italian vessels in waters necessary for American defense. He didn't declare war, but he authorized warfare. The undeclared naval war had begun. And it had begun because American forces were in Iceland, because American ships were escorting convoys, because Roosevelt had made the decision back in July to put American troops directly into the strategic center of the Atlantic War. Over the following months, more incidents occurred. The destroyer USS Kearney was torpedoed in October, 11 sailors killed. The destroyer USS Reuben James was sunk in October, 115 sailors killed. Each incident brought America closer to formal war. Each incident proved that the line between neutrality and belligerence had already been crossed. The Iceland decision mattered for another reason that wouldn't become clear for years. When America officially entered the war in December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, military planners faced a massive strategic question. Where should American forces deploy first? What should the priority be? The answer was already determined. Iceland had established the pattern. America's primary focus would be the Atlantic, not the Pacific. Defeating Germany first, then Japan. The strategic infrastructure was already in place. The bases, the supply lines, the command relationships with Britain. This wasn't an obvious choice. Japan had attacked America directly. American ships burned in Pearl Harbor. American territories in the Philippines and Wake Island were under assault. Public rage focused on Japan, not Germany. But the strategic decision had already been made, locked in by the infrastructure Roosevelt had built across the Atlantic. Iceland hadn't just been a base, it had been a declaration of strategic intent. Europe first, Atlantic first. The war against Nazi Germany was America's priority. That decision shaped everything that followed. The invasions of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, the allocation of resources between theaters. Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific would complain for years that he was being starved of resources. He was right. Those resources were going to Europe, flowing through the infrastructure that began with Iceland. We're building a community of history enthusiasts who understand that wars are won in map rooms and conference halls as much as on battlefields. Share this video with someone who loves military history and drop a comment. Did you know about Roosevelt's Iceland decision before watching this? What do you think would have happened if he hadn't made it? Let's talk about it. The soldiers who occupied Iceland in July 1941 didn't know any of this. They knew they'd been sent to a cold, barren island in the middle of the Atlantic where nothing seemed to happen. They built bases in lava fields that tore up bulldozer treads. They patrolled coasts where German commandos might land, but never did. They manned radar stations through storms that made visibility zero. They watched convoys pass by, tiny lines of ships crawling across the horizon toward Britain, and wondered if their presence made any difference. Most of them never fired a shot in anger. Iceland never saw combat. No German invasion came. No U-boats attacked the harbor. Hitler had considered invading Iceland back in 1940, an operation called Icarus, but the British occupation had made it unfeasible. Now American forces made it impossible. To the soldiers stationed there, it must have seemed like a waste, a forgotten garrison on a forgotten island far from the real war. They read about battles in North Africa, campaigns in Russia, air raids over Germany. Meanwhile, they stood guard duty in the rain, maintained equipment that never saw action, and counted the days until rotation home. But they were wrong. Every convoy that passed safely beneath air cover from Iceland was a convoy that reached Britain intact. Every U-boat that withdrew rather than attack an American escorted convoy was a U-boat that sank fewer ships. Every week that Britain stayed in the war was another week closer to American entry, to the tide turning, to victory. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for years. U-boats would sink thousands more ships. Tens of thousands of sailors would die in the freezing waters between continents. But the balance shifted in July 1941. Not dramatically, not obviously, but definitively. The numbers told the story. In the second half of 1941, after American forces occupied Iceland, Allied shipping losses began to decline. Not because U-boats became less aggressive, not because convoy tactics improved dramatically, but because the gap in the middle of the Atlantic grew smaller. Air cover extended further. Escort ships could refuel and continue. The Black Pit, while still dangerous, was no longer a guaranteed killing ground. By 1942, with America fully in the war, Iceland hosted thousands of aircraft and dozens of warships. Long-range patrol bombers flew from Icelandic bases around the clock. Destroyers and corvettes refueled in Reykjavik between convoy runs. The island became a massive logistics hub, a fortress in the middle of the ocean, exactly what Roosevelt had envisioned. Roosevelt's decision to occupy Iceland meant that Britain would survive long enough for America to fully enter the war. It meant the Atlantic would become a battleground where American forces fought from day one. It meant the strategic framework for defeating Nazi Germany was in place before the first shot was officially fired. One president made one decision. 4,000 Marines landed on one island. The war that America wasn't fighting yet became the war America was already winning. At July 1941, President Roosevelt changed everything. Not with a declaration of war, not with a dramatic invasion, but with the quiet occupation of a volcanic island in the North Atlantic that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Sometimes the decisions that change history aren't the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're the ones that establish the conditions for victory months or years before anyone realizes the war has already been won. Iceland was that decision. The moment when America stopped pretending to be neutral and started building the infrastructure for total war. The moment when the Atlantic became an American ocean, not a German killing ground. And it happened because one president looked at a map covered in red marks showing sunken ships and decided that enough was enough. Britain would not starve. The convoys would get through. And if that meant American troops on foreign soil before Congress declared war, then so be it. History remembers Pearl Harbor as the moment America entered World War II. December 7th, 1941. The day that will live in infamy. But the real moment came 5 months earlier. July 7th, 1941. The day American troops landed in Iceland and President Roosevelt committed America to a war it wouldn't officially join for another 5 months. That was the day everything changed. That was the decision that doomed Hitler's Atlantic strategy and ensured that Britain would survive long enough for the arsenal of democracy to turn the tide. One island. One decision. One president who understood that sometimes you don't wait for war to come to you. Sometimes you position your pieces on the board before anyone else realizes the game has already begun. The legacy of that decision would echo through the entire war and beyond. Iceland remained an American base throughout the conflict. After the war, it became a cornerstone of NATO, hosting American forces through the Cold War and into the 21st century. The base Roosevelt established in 1941 remained strategically vital for 70 years. But in July 1941, none of that was visible. All anyone could see was 4,000 Marines stepping onto volcanic rock, wondering why they were there, not knowing they were standing at the pivot point of the war. Roosevelt knew, Churchill knew, And Hitler, reading the intelligence reports in Berlin, knew. The Atlantic War had changed. The mathematics of convoy battles had shifted. The gap was closing. One island, one decision. Everything changed.